And we are live with Benjamin Riley, the founder and executive director of Deans for Impact, also formerly investigator of the New England education system for a national education nonprofit. Also spent some time as the deputy attorney general for the state of California. While you've done a lot, Benjamin, and also the recipient of a lot of fancy book learning, I've noticed. Some credentials that maybe 1% of the American population has. So welcome, Ben. Thank you for coming to make the show smarter.
Well, I deny all of that, but I appreciate your kind words and I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you.
So listen, your organization says over 200,000 new teachers graduate from teacher prep programs every year, and that the majority of them actually say, I don't know if it's the majority, you tell me what the number is, but say that they are not prepared to teach, on day one. That seems to be like a situation that has existed forever. You're never really going to be prepared on day one to teach. But is that true? And what's your position on, what are you working on to address that as a problem?
Yeah, good question. So I'll take it in two chunks. The first part of the question is just what do teachers think about their teacher education programs and if they were prepared? And the reality is we actually don't have great data on that. There's probably the most quoted statistic comes from some research that Arthur Levine at Columbia did years ago, which said that like 60% of teacher candidates said they felt unprepared after finishing their programs. And it wasn't a super representative sample that he took, but that number just became sort of like the standard talking point. What I can say is that given the limited amount of time that teachers have in their pre-service preparation, it's unlikely that they'll ever feel fully prepared given the complexities of teaching. Right now, typically, even the longest program, you're looking at like a year and a half, 2 years of training, only a portion of which is actually going to involve direct classroom experience usually. And so, one of the goals that we have is to not try to, imagine that schools of education or the programs that prepare teachers are going to be able to, produce and prepare people for absolutely every contingency. What they can do, and this gets to the second piece, what they can do perhaps a better job of is equipping teachers with the basic knowledge that they're going to need in order to grow themselves as educators in their job. And so a big piece of what we've done with Deans for Impact is to focus on, in the time that programs that are preparing teachers have these future teachers in their care, how can you create a set of experiences that will be most likely to give you a theory of how students learn that is grounded in our best available understanding of the science, and create a series of practical experiences that will get you to apply that science in your practice so that you begin your teaching career with some of that experience and that knowledge as a foundation that then you can build upon.
Does this actually, when you do that, does that lengthen the time that it takes to become a teacher? Does that mean that it's going to take longer now? Is that like you do your normal program that you would do already, and then you do something like a medical residency and it lengthens how long and how expensive it is to become a teacher?
So another good question. I actually think from our perspective, what we've been very, very clear about is that quality matters more than quantity. You can have a long residency program that will give a future teacher a lot of exposure to the classroom. But if they're paired with a teacher who is not particularly effective as a mentor, what are they actually going to be learning? You get a lot of situations where teachers will sometimes, like a big thing that we hear that happens is, teachers will get dropped into a school midway through the school year, and they'll observe what's happening, and they won't realize all of the things that preceded that the teacher did in order to set things up. And sometimes the master teachers, the mentor teachers who are responsible, they've been doing it so long that they don't necessarily know how to explain what it is that they've done. This is called in some circles the curse of knowledge. When you have this knowledge, you may not be able to impart it because you forget what it was like when you didn't have that knowledge. So actually for us, it's not, we're sort of, I wouldn't say fully agnostic about the amount of time that you need to prepare a teacher. You do need some amount of time, like just, 5 weeks is not optimal. But if you can design experiences that are more are more carefully structured in order to get you the skills and the knowledge that you need, you could actually have a lot more impact and potentially even in some instances shorten the amount of time that you have to be in, say, theoretical coursework. So, long-winded way of saying that it's really more about quality than quantity.
So you mentioned Arthur Levine, very knowledgeable person. He wrote a document that I read years ago that was shocking to me. It was about teacher prep. As a layperson, as a person on the sidelines reading that, I just was unaware that there was what he considered to be a large problem with the schools of education that educate our teachers and prepare our teachers for the workplace. I think he said something like 600 programs nationally, and that he found some, though, that were across lines of whether they were religious schools or non-religious schools, whether they were public or private, whether whatever, were getting it right. There was a fraction of them. First of all, how big of a problem is it that you think, if we went back upstream a little bit and just talked about the 600 or more, I don't know how many programs it actually is, what percentage of those do you think are actually getting it right and doing a good job?
You're not going to like this answer because it's going to sound wishy-washy and punting, but
Here
I
comes the
don't
politics.
know. I don't know, and it's genuinely the case, because one of the things that is a little bit challenging in this work is that schools of education are sort of a legal fiction. The same way that, like, a country, right? Like, what is a country, right? A country is a conceptual idea, but then it's made up, obviously, of very real things. But, like, there's so much variation, right, within any country that, like, sort of describe, like, well, what is it, good or bad, sort of misses out usually on a lot of the complexity. So I have seen with my own eyes a single school of education that can have an outstanding program for preparing people to be elementary school teachers, and then walk across the hallway and you can see a struggling program to prepare people to become high school teachers, because the path of experiences and the professors involved and the cooperating school districts involved are all completely different for those paths. So we have kind of this general notion of preparing people to be teachers, but actually there's a lot of subspecialties and a lot of differences within that. What I would say is that, to give a slightly less wishy-washy answer, like, on the whole, we take the position that there's not a single program in the United States and probably the world that couldn't improve. So for us, it's less, we've never really been that interested in the game of, like, let's rank our nation's teacher prep programs from best to worst and figure out who's best and do what they're doing. That's really not, from our perspective, where the impetus for a social change is going to happen. What we instead are trying to do is saying that, like, we can strengthen the system. There's some ideas that teachers need to know, should know, that we're not doing as much as we could be to ensure that they both understand and know them and get the chance to sort of see what they mean for their practice. So we think basically everywhere there's opportunity for that improvement.
So tell me more about that strategy and that theory. You just mentioned rank. Americans love to rank things.
Yeah.
It's the way that we see the world. I don't know if it's just the Western world that does that, but it is very much an American thing. Rank. Yeah. And then if you come to the top of the rank, it's supposed to tell you what you're supposed to do, like for everybody else, right?
Right.
And it sounds like you've just blown that up as a theory, as like not the best theory of change. It sounds like your theory of change is to say, no, the things that you're practicing are principles that will be good everywhere, whether you're at the top or the bottom. Is that kind of what you're saying? So it's none of this best practice stuff. It's more of like, we know some things are just eternal. They work through all the rankings. I don't know where I fall on that, because I do think there's something to be said about, well, let me just ask you, if you do have really bad actors, like, how do you weed those out if you're not ranking or have some sort of objective way of understanding whether they're doing a good job or not?
Yeah, well, and let me be clear that I'm not necessarily saying that there should be no accountability for schools of education at all, and that let's understand that the role of deans for impact as an organization is to help programs grow, and that we think basically all programs probably have the capacity and hopefully the desire to grow, and let's reach them where they are. There are definitely bad actors. Ironically, and this, we don't need to go too far down this road. One of the things that's strange, though, is that not a lot of energy is actually paid attention to in the education sector to, like, the worst actors in this space. Because you have a number of states, including Texas, where I'm based, where you've got sort of like quote unquote alternative certification programs that have come along and are, preparing teachers in large numbers. And some of these programs we have data on, at least I can speak to Texas. It's pretty grim in terms of the outcomes. And yet, like, you don't, like, when people talk about teacher preparation, all of the energy is usually directed at, well, these schools of education and what are they doing, housed inside traditional universities. That's still where the majority is. So it's not like we should, say, like, write that off. But it's interesting to me that there's actually, we do have some insight into some of the alternatives to those programs. And it's not like they're killing it. They are much more, I would say, trending towards like low cost, quick providers, get teachers into the classroom, and then let's figure out whether they know how to teach. And some of the programs, you'll have a large number of those teachers leaving the classroom before they even finish their first year, which is a huge nightmare for schools when that happens. So I think it's sort of like there is a role to play. We have a policy wing at Deans for Impact where we talk to states about, states are, if they're making a public investment in their schools of education, they have a right to have expectations around that. And there will be times when you have actors where it's like, okay, this is a real problem. The interesting thing, though, is that schools of education are not that dissimilar from like K-12 schools, where like the political will to shut down programs is rarely there. So even again, when you identify a quote unquote bad actor, someone who clearly is preparing teachers in a way that is not demonstrably helping kids, what are you going to do then? You're going to shut them down? Well, you can go that route, but it's hard.
So on that point, Arthur Levine, again, his document like really shocked me a while back when I first read it, because he's so forensic about the problem. He goes through, he details a lot of what he sees at issue, but he calls them cash cows. He calls colleges of ed cash cows, which I had, I adopted that after hearing him say the way that goes down, the economics of a college, that these have a wide open funnel. The wide end of the entrance funnel is wide, and coming out gets smaller. But say for something like engineering or other schools, the wide end of the funnel to get in is smaller, right? So selectivity, a part of this. Well, I have two questions. One is about selectivity, about who gets to get in. It seems like Amanda Ripley and others, when they write, I think it's Amanda Ripley, who write about, like, did she do the smartest kids in the world? Whoever did the smartest kids in the world. I remember it talking a lot about Hong Kong and Singapore and Japan and other places where becoming a teacher is pretty hard. It's like the selectivity part is hard, which makes it the quality go up. And I also read something a while back from Kathleen Porter McGee, which I'll never forget. It was talking about Finland and what they did. And one of the things that they did was shut down their colleges of ed. Apparently, I'm not an expert, but shut down their colleges of ed and then rebooted the ones that they thought actually could be aligned. It sounds like you just said that's not possible in the United States, like actually doing something so drastic like that. Like you get a secretary of ed who comes in. I don't even know if they have the power to do it, but that's not, we can't do what Finland did, I guess, is part of the question here. Is that right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that is what I'm saying. And I you gave me a lot to respond to there. So
I'm sorry about that. It was like a countdown.
That's fine. So a couple of things I'll say. First, one of the biggest myths, and I know Arthur wrote it, and the dean of Harvard's Graduate School of Education said it too, and I think at one point Secretary Duncan picked it up. The single biggest myth in teacher education, at least as it sits in the United States today, is that these are cash cows. There's not a single leader of any program that we've worked with, and we work with programs across the spectrum, who would tell you that they are cash cows for the university. I don't know how that got started. I think it kind of was based on this notion of, they'll just take whomever in. And it is true that, if you look sort of at, average GPAs and what have you across a university, they're typically lower for schools of education than they are, say, for engineering or computer science or whatever the department may be. But we got to ask ourselves, like just because that's true doesn't mean that these are cash cows. And certainly, given what's happening right now under the pandemic, I mean, most of the institutions and the leaders that we're talking to are looking at budget cuts ranging up to 50%. That's obviously some, tied to the pandemic, but even prior to that, enrollments in traditional schools of education had been falling for a while.
Mm-hmm.
So the cash cow thing is a myth. It should be killed. People should retire it. It's just not true. It's just, it's not actually the case that schools of ed are like taking on these massive numbers and that's somehow funding other aspects of the university. Now, on the selectivity piece generally, we absolutely could not do what something like the nation of Finland did. And I actually ran the numbers on this way back. It seemed like Finland reached its peak in sort of the ed reform zeitgeist dialogue maybe like 5-6 years ago, and I ran the numbers back of the envelope that if like they consolidated, as I remember it, and I may get a few of the details here wrong, but they consolidated essentially from like 40 institutions that prepared teachers down to 10. So they shut down, essentially 3/4 of what they had. Well, if you did that in the United States, you'd be looking at, and I'm just going to use the traditional space, which is like 80 to 85%. You'd be going from like, 4,000 institutions down to 500. It's not going to happen. And it would be a disaster if it happened, because you'd have huge swaths of communities that would not have any teachers being prepared. I mean, people sort of forget that this is still a local profession and that our schools of education are dispersed throughout the country.
Well, do the numbers on that, Benjamin. Do the numbers on that. So if it was down to 500, that would be like 10 programs per state. That seems like a lot. That seems like a lot to have.
Well, I mean, again, we need 350,000 teachers a year. And you're imagining now that you're going to create this infrastructure. And again, like this is not a situation. And this goes back to the selectivity piece. Like at the end of the day, this is still a profession that relative to inflation has dramatically underpays people for having a college degree. And so you're sort of saying like, well, let's make it harder to become a teacher. And it's like, well, have you changed any puts? Because if all you've done is raise a barrier without actually changing sort of what you get on the other side of that, you're not going to have teachers. And then you'll see, and we already have this happening in pockets in this country to a degree that should concern us, people going to things like just hiring full-time substitutes who have no training whatsoever. That's what would happen. And it would be communities, frankly, that are most vulnerable that I think would suffer the most under a sort of close and consolidate. It's just not, in a country as diverse and as geographically widespread as we are, it just doesn't strike me as remotely viable.
So you couldn't do what Finland did, which is to shut down large number of the schools, reboot a small number that were high quality and have really strong centralized control of that small number of them, and then raise the profile of the profession and the pay and the benefits and everything at the same time. Like, let's say, for instance, we did this. We got down to 500 schools, and then we made them all part of, and this is just me, this is not my theory of how things work in the world, but I'm just, as a thought exercise, you had 10 programs per state. They were all through the public college state system, and it was underneath that central authority, and they were all going to be pretty uniform, aligned in how they taught and whatnot. And at the same time, the entry pay for all of those was $80K for a teacher coming out of those programs, 80, 90, let's even say 100K. Is it more acceptable then? Now you've raised the profile of you probably get more people going in because now it's way more attractive. It's not 35K, which I don't know what the average to come in, but I think it might in Minnesota be somewhere between 36 and 41.
Right.
If you raise that almost triple with only 10 schools, does it work now? Now that I've just pitched that to you, does that work?
I mean, why not imagine a pony while we're at it? But sure, I mean, sure. If that were to happen, that would make it easier. But I think the challenge that would still sit there is like, show me the 10 programs that are just capable of scaling up. Like scaling up. I mean, you know this in your role, when not hosting these shows. Scaling up is a huge thing. Scaling up is a huge challenge. It's one thing to design something and be able to do it effectively at a certain size, but to then say, okay, now you're going to do it at this size. So like you consolidate, say, to these programs and then say, all right, like everybody do it this way. And it's like, and now you're going to have to train 5 times the amount of teachers that you were training previously. Well, where do they get the faculty? Does this imagine that people are moving all over that state or the country to come be faculty at this institution? Where do they do the teacher training? Because keep in mind that like most universities right now have real challenges just to get placements into K-12 schools for their student teaching experiences. So now you've actually shrunk the domain of school districts in which you're working in. So it's really, I think, all of this is, probably too hypothetical to even imagine. But even if you had the good part of what you described in the hypothetical around the teacher salaries, which I would love to see happen, I think you'd still need the sort of geographically dispersed way in which we train teachers today to be the reality, which is again why we're focused on trying to bring this science of learning and trying to bring these ideas to the entire field. Yes, but still identifying leaders in the field. I think there's absolutely a play to be made around saying, where are the programs we should look to that are taking this on to inspire a movement across the field? So in that sense, there is definitely an element of Deans for Impact, which is trying to lift up those who have leaders and are sort of pioneering this work.
So I'm a little confused by your answer in one way. Most of it makes sense to me, but here's the one way in which it confused me just a little bit. So first of all, I'm glad that both of us agree that like 36K to 41K as an entrance into the field is actually something that we're going to have to figure out. We have to like change that at some point. But the kind of quid pro quo in raising that is going to be that it's going to have to come with more selectivity, I think, or more expectation that you're getting high quality entrance into the field. It just can't be all people get a trophy, everybody comes. I'm not saying that's the way it is now. I'm just saying there's a trade-off. The lawmakers, when they're doing a budget, are probably going to have that kind of question on the table when they talk about spending more money on what we pay teachers, I think.
But why at the beginning and not at the end would be my interruption of that, because it's like,
no, say more. Like, what do you mean?
Yeah. So I think I agree with you that like we need to do a better job that by the time someone is coming into the field as a teacher, that we should feel confident that person knows a lot more about teaching than anybody else does, that they're experts, that they are professionals. And right now, I think there's a general sense, unfortunately, amongst a lot of people in the public that that's not really true. They're not really true. But the thing that I'm pushing on is that I don't think the selectivity needs to be on the front end of who gets into a school of education. The selectivity, if it exists, should be on the back end, which is after you've gone through the process of becoming a teacher. Are you demonstrably ready to go in? That's where, so it's, for me, I guess it's just, maybe you're thinking about selectivity in the same way, but I just would push against it being something like, now you have to have a GPA here and SAT scores or whatever up here. I mean, frankly, all the trends in higher ed are moving against that generally anyway. And much more about sort of like the transition from pre-service preparation to actually teaching.
So I am thinking a little bit about the Amanda Ripley stuff, like, the nations that she profiled where they did raise the standard of what it took to even get into the teacher prep program. I'm hearing what you're saying right now too, is like another point of sale on that could be at, the time when you're doing your practice stuff or praxis stuff, when you're trying to actually become certified to become a teacher after you've been trained. So I don't know that I have any reasonable pushback or anything about like where the point of sale should be about the selectivity, but it did seem like in the Amanda Ripley stuff, she was pointing out that the other countries did have something in place to say that you can't even get into the teacher prep programs unless you're high performing in some way. Sounds like you're not for that. That's not something you're looking at. So
I really do think, again, I don't keep banging the same drum, but scale matters here. So like, Finland prepares, I tweeted this with Pasi Sahlberg once. Finland prepares 2,000 teachers a year.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
2000, you tell me you need to get 2000.
Yeah.
We're going to use, and Finland has a very interesting sort of,
Mhm.
essentially their equivalent of the SAT is this multi-day, you probably read about it in your book.
Mhm.
It's
It's harsh.
crazy.
It's harsh.
It's
Yeah.
harsh.
Yeah.
And it decides a lot of like paths that you can take, is my understanding as a Finnish student. So of that, they say, okay, of our entire student body, we're going to take, I guess it's probably not even 2,000 every year, but like, so that, compared to us, we're at 250,000.
Jeez. You know what? I think
It's-
I forget that oftentimes when people talk about Finland. Finland's the size of Minnesota, the state that I live in. And I've joked before that we basically are Finland. If you come to Minnesota, we basically are Finland in many ways. Same, religiously similar, population similar, and very much a very strong social safety net in this state. Again, as I always put it, we're the Silicon Valley of human services, health and human services. Our budget, 40% of our budget is education, 40% of our budget is health and human services. So we couldn't be more Finland than Finland. And we have nation leading gaps in achievement between white kids and black kids. Our white kids are doing very well. Our non-white kids are not as much. Okay, so I want to get to something you've said, scale, a couple of times here, which I think scale is a boogeyman of education, period, because first of all, I always think that scale's the wrong question, and so much that it bothers me about education, because we need to descale some things, and not all things are meant to be blown up and big, and some things work in small pockets and whatnot. And it's not until the bean counters come in and say, how can we scale this, that all hell breaks loose. And then when all hell breaks loose, they say, well, the idea must have been bad in the first place. Not, oh, we're terrible at scaling. Like, it's just not a talent that we have at scaling. But when I think about what I want to scale, think about your organization. And you guys have this paper, The Building Blocks of for Effective Educator Preparation. One of your papers. I saw a thing, in preparing for today, read through some of the modeling, feedback, practice, alignment. So for people listening, modeling, feedback, practice, alignment, 4 building blocks to effective educator preparation. And each of those requires its own seminar, its own day to talk about.
At least.
So now I come to you and I say, Benjamin, those to me sound like a discrete enough number of things to focus on that you're saying is a very powerful lever for changing educator preparation. And I say to you, great, we need to scale that. We need to scale it across all schools. And if they're not doing a good job of these 4 building blocks, we have to call it what it is. So now what? How do we scale these 4 building blocks? I love it because I love 4 things or 3 things, right? And for them to be powerful. So help me with first of all, let's just start with what's important about those 4 things. Let's just start there. Okay.
Well, okay. You want to start there about what's important.
And then we'll come back. And then we'll come back to scale.
Well, you raised actually a deeply profound question that I love. So I want to make sure we get to that.
Because do it justice.
You've done something really, really important with that question. But I'll come back to it. What's important about the specific building blocks, as we've seen it, is that this really came from our work visiting schools of education all around the country, seeing, as we had seen on the ground, sort of where we were seeing teachers who were on the cusp of entering the classroom, who had a sort of sense of professional identity and a confidence that was very different than many of their peers. And what we were able to distill is that when we found those programs, that there really were these common elements, these principles that seemed to be pretty required, or at least integrated into the approach that those programs, that to our eyes were successful in preparing future teachers, were taking. And what was really interesting, and here's where sort of everything starts to connect for us in a sort of quantum mechanics meets general relativity sort of way. The ideas that are in the building blocks map very closely to the ideas around how individuals think and learn. So in other words, there are some scientific insights we have into human cognition, how you and I and anybody who walks on this planet makes sense of the world and is able to, learn and acquire knowledge. And I think that what we have seen is that those principles actually apply at an organizational level. And if you can sort of take some of what we know about how an individual learns, you can actually sort of map it up to how an organization, quote unquote, thinks and learns. And this brings me to, I think, what is the really profound piece underlying your question around scale, because what I think is mistaken in education land over and over again is that we want a quote unquote intervention to scale. So something, as you just said, something you try as a small program or a pilot or a thing as an intervention is like something someone does in a particular school, a particular reading program, or a particular math app or whatever. And somebody sees some positive results and then says, as you say, the bean counters come and the money comes in and it's scaled, and lo and behold, everyone's disappointed. The beauty of science is that it's an idea, and it has application in theoretically any circumstance in which you're interacting with students. So if you take the ideas of the science of learning and get them into the hands of educators, they should be able to apply it no matter what interventions or programs or things that the schools are doing. So it's actually shifting away from this notion of like, find a model and replicate the model. And instead it's like, take the scientific ideas and make those prevalent. And that's a pretty profound distinction, I think.
But you get the inclination that if I'm a superintendent, for instance, and I hear you speak about these 4 building blocks of teacher prep, I'm going to want to start pushing my state leaders or the people who provide me with teachers that. I read in Arthur Levine's document, he talked about the principals in Milwaukee when they were surveyed, were able to say which colleges they wanted to get their teachers from, because they knew from firsthand experience. And if I was a state lawmaker or somebody in power, I would hear that and I would think we've got to do something to make everybody like that group of schools. And you telling me what you're telling me about these 4 building blocks, the inclination is to say, well, I think everybody this should somehow be systemic. It should somehow be put into the system. I don't know that are you confronting that anymore? Are you saying that's not like the inclination to do that is not the right one? Or are you saying there's a more generalized way to do it?
No, I'm saying that absolutely that we're trying to make it systemic. In fact, one of our values at Deans for Impact is, transform the system. And so I think what I'm distinguishing is that, I mean, look, not to sound self-interested here, but Deans for Impact, we do the work with programs to help them bring principles like building blocks, principles around learning science into the experiences that they provide to their teacher candidates. And I can say with not any sense of false modesty, there is no way we will ever, as an organization, be able to single-handedly do this work. We've got to build a movement. We've got to get state leaders going, okay, these are the right principles. Let's work together and figure out how to bring them into our schools of education. And some of that work is going to be taken on by the programs themselves. Perhaps there are other organizations that can bring it in, but it's sort of like, no social movement that I'm aware of rests on a single entity or a single institution. They're a constellation of actors, and there's a sort of general sense of what you want to have accomplished, and there's sort of some pursuing some strategies, some pursuing the others, but there's a notion of like, we're all in this for this particular outcome. And so that's kind of the shift that I wish we could have in education, which would be to say, let's focus on making sure that our educators have our best scientific understanding of how students learn, and that we are designing our organizations with those principles like at the foundation. And then like we're going to have different manifestations of that, but it's not about like, take this particular intervention that someone did a randomized control trial on and just try to make that what everybody does. There's just the history of that is
terrible. Terrible. So Stephanie Erickson is watching, and she's a teacher who says, I was taught in my teacher prep program many of the misconceptions, the document blows up. And by the document, we put a link to your document in there. So she's like literally firsthand saying, I was taught things that your document blows up. Again, as a person in power, a lawmaker, I would want to approach that some kind of way.
Yeah.
I would want to say, stop it.
Yeah.
So, but I can't. Like, what's a person empowered to do? Hearing something like that, knowing that here, for instance, in the state of Minnesota, we have multiple teacher prep programs that I know you don't like ratings, but we're not rated well. They were not treated kindly, I think, by some national rankings or whatnot. We have students going through them every day. And if I was a lawmaker, like my local representative who is in tune to these type of issues, what is it for them to do to help correct that as a problem?
Yeah, well, I hope I don't sound like I'm just broken recording on this, but and thank you, Stephanie, for listening and for your question out there. I'm sorry that you had some of the what's sometimes called neuromyths propagated. So, like, one thing you could do if you were a policymaker is the heavy hand approach, the top down approach, and say, stop doing that, and try to force schools of education to not teach things that are not aligned with the science of learning. And despite my unabashed enthusiasm for these ideas, I think that's probably going to be an effective way to go, in part because, to your point, the way higher ed is designed now, and it's going to be, I think, a long time perhaps before we see it change, you just don't have a lot of direct ability to go in and get that to change. So our game is persuasion.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is the way to persuade? And that's where, again, it goes back to leadership. Like, what makes you change your behavior? I think typically it's when someone you trust says, well, I'm doing things a little bit differently, and I'd like to show you that, or I'd like to describe that to you. So what a state leader might do, instead of the top-down approach, is to try to find leaders in the field who do embrace science of learning and lift that up. Perhaps put some funding behind building a network of teacher prep programs that want to work together in order to bring the science of learning into their coursework and into their field experiences. We do that work at Deans for Impact, and we see people who gravitate to it, and we could see a lot more of it if more people actually agreed that this was something that mattered and should be prioritized. And again, it goes to like this approach of like, let's start with like a build and grow and improve mentality, because that's at the end of the day, that's the mentality we want our teachers to have, right?
So actually, I think you just helped me, though. I think that just helped me a lot. So something actionable that could be done that probably won't get into the same problems that we have with scaling or top-down stuff is we could put together a statewide pool of money that creates the network of teachers that are interested and want to learn this. That's a very doable pilot project. That's a real thing that I, as a citizen, as a layperson listening to you right now, can say, I have a pretty good relationship with my rep. Maybe I should ask my rep to pull together a pilot program that helps teachers network around the learning science of learning.
Yeah, I mean, look,
okay, that's doable. I like that.
Right, and we're talking Minnesota. You know full well, your Minnesota fellow native Eric Colenzi and the Research Network, I think, is one contribution to that. I mean, I think that's a grassroots network of teachers talking internationally about learning science issues. There are other existing groups that I think sort of dabble. They don't necessarily prioritize learning science much. And by the way, learning science is one piece of it. I think there's all sorts of interesting subject-specific sort of conversations for educators to get into. We've made our focus around the learning science piece because we see that as sort of broadly applicable. But you've got interesting pedagogical questions that you could explore in mathematics around teaching specific ideas, that we have interesting research that's been done. And again, these are the sort of things that I would love to see practicing teachers sort of taking on. I do think that it's no accident that Deans for Impact is focused on the School of Education side, because I do think it's easier to get these ideas into the system before you've been teaching for 20 years. Because if you're, I don't know, Stephanie, who asked this question, I don't know how long she's been teaching, but if you go to a teacher who's been practicing for 30 years, who believes strongly in some people are visual learners and some people are audio learners, and newsflash to the audience for this, there's not a lot of evidence that there are visual learners and audio learners who actually learn better.
Stop there for 1 second, Ben. Just stop there.
Yeah, here we go. This is the landmine. Yeah.
Well, no, it's not. I mean, it's for me. I mean, I take these opportunities when I have you guys on the show where I can like get a straight answer from people that know what the hell they're talking about. So this learning styles thing is something that I would still be believing if I hadn't encountered guys like you, right? I'd probably be saying it at dinner parties and stuff. Well, my kid's learning style is such and such. Yeah. So it becomes popular like urban lore or, urban myth, and then it takes root in the larger society or whatnot. That to me is something that comes out of I don't know where it came from exactly, except for I know there was a book or something like that. But it comes out of academia in some way, shape, or form that does a lot of damage over a long period of time. And that makes me wonder about a centralized quality control of what comes out of these schools.
Yeah. Well, I question whether it actually came out of schools of education. I think that it is so intuitively powerful that I think for a long time people just didn't think to question it, because what's really important to get here is that people have beliefs about how they learn best, and those beliefs are their beliefs. I mean, if you tell someone, yeah, you think you're a visual learner, but you're not, and they've told themselves and they believe that they learn better reading versus listening to something, they're just going to reject you for saying that if all you do is say that you're wrong. And I think that perhaps the idea just wasn't examined very closely because it's so intuitively powerful. And this again goes where science, we're living in an age where science is under strain, but I feel like it's worth defending and it's worth advocating for, because it's like, of all the things in education, like, it's actually really easy to test the question of, well, do people learn better if the information you want them to learn is presented in their preferred style? That's actually been tested a ton of time, and it's been found very lacking. Now, again, though, I know you seem to keep wanting to raise the iron glove, and I'm going to keep trying to put the velvet one on the other hand. It's like, if we want to change people's belief about that, I think the better way to do that is to not just confront them with, well, that's wrong and it's been disproven scientifically, so stop doing it, versus offering them a better model that is aligned to the science, that allows them to move off of it, or like even allows them to preserve some of their existing beliefs around it. Because here's what I've said about this, because this issue is such a flashpoint, not just for teachers, but for parents. People just are like, I learn this way. I know my kids want to learn this way. And it's like, okay, well, let's try to find some middle ground here. And it turns out one of the things that we know from the science of learning is that getting information in different, we'll call it modalities, actually helps you learn it better. So in other words, if you want to learn something about history, writing something and listening to something about it can help dual code it. You have different ways of bringing it into your memory. So hey, if you think that some students learn a little bit better visually and some learn a better audio, you can still do both of those things. Just make sure you do both. Make sure that you don't actually think that like some of your students learn this way and some of your students learn this way, and I'm only going to give it to them. Which, by the way, not to make it too controversial, but sometimes that can encode certain racial presumptions. It can encode certain socio-demographic presumptions around what sort of students can learn and what type of information they can learn. So one of the beauties, I think, of the science of learning is it's actually profoundly, it forces you to confront the fact. I think, let me back up for a second. This is something I really want to make sure that I mentioned, if nothing else. One of the key insights from learning science is that we all have, absent like a biological impairment, we all have essentially limitless capacity to build knowledge. If you think of the mind as a hard drive that can store things, as far as we know, there's no limit to the gigabytes in the hard drive, which is incredible. And I think what it means is that it means that we cannot allow for any set of life circumstances to become a reason for which we give up on the capacity for any student to learn.
Okay, wait. So say this again.
Yeah.
We have a limitless capacity. Say that part again.
Yeah.
Because I think you're about to blow my mind. So, all right. So say that part again.
Yeah. Well, actually, let me actually back it up, and I'll say that part again, but give it in a slightly larger context. So we have as far as we know, from a scientific perspective, we have essentially a limitless capacity to add to our knowledge. Meaning, like, we've learned, you and I are communicating right now, and anybody listening is understanding what we're saying because we've all learned the English language. Okay? There are a lot of people who don't learn the English language, but we've learned it. Therefore, when I'm talking to you, you're actually not taxing your cognitive abilities to understand what I'm saying. The content of what I'm saying, if I'm being confusing, you might not get it. But in terms of just knowing what I'm saying and translating it to the words and the ideas that the words represent, that's built in. And you have that.
Okay, so wait a second. Is this the cognitive load thing?
So thank you. This is where I'm going to get
Yeah.
to the larger
Okay.
context.
Okay.
Because that is different than the cognitive load thing, as you just put
Okay.
it. So when
Okay.
so basically, if you talk about how our minds work, what a cognitive scientist would say, and what my friend Dan Willingham has said, is like there is this incredibly simple model of the mind, which essentially divides our minds. Again, I'll use the computer analogy. There's like RAM, the read access memory, and then there's like the long-term hard drive, the gigabytes where you store all the information. And RAM is where, like, when you're firing up a program, something is happening. And that's our conscious thought. Like right now, people listening are hearing these ideas that I'm saying, and they're trying to figure out what I mean by them. That's where conscious thought is taking place.
Mm-hmm.
Cognitive load theory, which you just asked about, what it says is that our capacity to do that, the conscientious part, is actually severely limited. So that's the negative side. Of the positive side that I said earlier is that, like, it's actually really hard to think, and it taxes us. And if you do too much, if you put too much on to a student at a particular time, you can get to a point where they'll shut down. And I think everyone's experienced this. Like, you're struggling with something, you're trying something, it's unfamiliar, and for a while it can be challenging, you can even be invigorated. But if you eventually can't figure it out, and you're making no progress, and you're spending all of your cognitive efforts trying to figure it out, you can eventually just go into, like, essentially cognitive overload, and you shut down.
So I know
So
this isn't part of what we're discussing right now, but I find this a little fascinating, and I want to know more about this. So, if
yeah.
you're a person who's learning English as a second language, but you're being taught in your second language rather than your first language, and for part of that, it's taxing part of your cognitive load to figure out just the part about the language part, and I'm also trying to teach you math, or I'm
Yeah.
also trying to teach you something else. I mean, does that become an argument for being taught in your first language?
Taken to its extreme, it could be, because if you just wanted to impart the math idea, then
Mhm.
yes, teaching it in English, or whatever the second language is versus the first language, does add to those students' cognitive load, no question. So if, like,
Mhm.
you just wanted to try to bypass that challenge, then that would be one way to do it. But of course, rarely in education do we just have a single goal. Part of the complexity and the beauty, but also the head pounding frustration, is that usually there's multiple goals involved in the education process. So I wouldn't weigh in and say that, like, if we want to teach math to students who speak English as a second language, we should only do so in their first language, given that there may be other goals, including learning the second language, that is part of that process. However, this is the key. If you're a teacher who now understands cognition and the simple model of the mind that I just described, you will have a much richer appreciation for the unique cognitive challenges that your English language learners are going to be facing compared to those who don't. And you're going to have to think about what additional supports or changes you might make in order to address that. And you won't just take this approach of, and I don't think teachers typically do this, but I think when you get into the nuances of this, it actually starts to get really important, that they're going to start thinking about, like, okay, I know that certain students are going to face different cognitive obstacles in teaching this mathematical concept. What am I going to do about that? What am I going to do about that? And there's no, and this is the beauty, but also the drawback. Like, science doesn't give an answer to that question. What it says is that you need to try to have that model of the student learner in your mind, and then you're going to have to try to figure it out. And you're going to have to experiment and see what works and see what doesn't work, and try again. And so it's a shift from sort of like, here's the things that you can do in order to make sure your students learn, which I think is, I think we have very limited amount of knowledge around that, versus, like, here are the things that will give you an understanding of what's happening in your student's mind, that'll allow you to change what you do, hopefully to help them learn what it is you want them to learn.
I feel like I may have interrupted you. That to me is fascinating, by the way, and I think it could be another show. I just stopped you because I was really fascinated by this part, and I thought there might be some equity considerations when you think about that. And I think we could do a whole show on different ethnicities and different groups, what they bring to class, and whether or not what you just said actually causes some equity concerns for how we teach them, or what we have in mind when we teach them.
Well, look, I mean, I would happily do that show with you. And in some ways, I think it's one of the most important things for future teachers, and frankly, all teachers, parents, maybe all of all of humanity, to understand, which is the unfortunate, there's a drawback to the beautiful principle that I described about the unlimited capacity we have to learn, which is, while it is true that it is unlimited in terms of what we can add to our store and our memory, um, it is radically inequitable over time, because it's the ability to acquire knowledge is cumulative. The more you learn, the easier it becomes to learn.
Mhm.
So what we see, and you can see this, anyone I think who's grown up in life can see that there are some people who, like, school works, they're learning more, they enjoy it, they graduate, they go on, they get higher education. And then there are those who, as time accumulates, it gets more and more difficult. They're unhappy. Some of them drop out. Some of them don't continue on. All of that, in my opinion, is really driving off of the fact that if the knowledge in the earliest parts of our life starts to diverge, it's almost, I mean, this was going to be a controversial metaphor, but it's almost like capitalism, where, like, capital accumulates capital. It's like, if you have the capital, you keep accumulating it, right? I mean, Thomas Piketty's work out of France is, all of it was like, the returns to capital are like much greater than anything else. And so in a way, the same seems to be true from a cognitive standpoint.
Mhm.
And so that's, yes, it could be a whole show thinking about, so given that, what are the obligations that teachers have? What are the things that they need to do to try to address that? And it's not, the answers to those questions are not easy.
It's funny where you came to on that point, because you said earlier in the show we have some political differences, and this might be one. Because you said capital, and I've talked a lot about Black educational capital, and I've talked about, like, Vanessa Siddle Walker's work in going back and rescuing from history some of what that Black educational capital was that was lost after Brown v. Board, when we decimated Black schools, we fired Black teachers, and we demoted Black principals, and we didn't pay attention to the fact that they weren't just jobs and teachers. They actually had amassed some capital over time about teaching Black children that wasn't really valued. It wasn't really seen as like a thing. Like, it was almost like they had nothing to contribute to these kids, and if the kids would just be better off if we just switched them over to other schools, to wider schools. And I love the term Black educational capital, because those teachers had figured out a way across states to work together on the way that they would assess kids, the ways that they would take the white standards and translate them into their schools to make sure they were preparing kids for the real world and all that stuff. And it was real tangible product they had come up with. They had come up with something that Vanessa Siddle Walker went back and rescued. So I do think, in terms about, like, now we're having discussions about trauma-informed learning, and what you just said, making sure that we're paying attention to what the kids are bringing into the classroom, so that we can adjust the way that we work with them and teach them. That part of that is building back their own educational capital that may have been lost for them. But that's an aside. Joshua Israel Stewart, who I happen to know, has a very familiar last name to me, likes to heckle me in the comments of my daily show. So Joshua,
like already.
Yes, Joshua Israel Stewart, who heckles me on a regular basis, says, can Benjamin repeat where he was going with not allowing any set of circumstances to shape expectations for learning? He was about to drop a gem, and implicit in that is, Dad, you interrupted him. So let's come back to this.
Well, so, and that statement, which I did make, is probably a bit of an overstatement that perhaps will be unsatisfying when I get into the more nuanced thing I'm about to say. But, like, when I described the simple model of the mind a moment ago, I was describing essentially really what's happening up here, the process of conscious thought, and then bringing ideas from our long-term memory to interact with whatever ideas we're consciously thinking about. But the other side of that is is the environment, the stimulation that's bringing information to you that you're interacting with to build new knowledge. And again, for me, what's beautiful about learning science is it says that the interaction between conscious thought and whatever's coming in from the environment can build limitless knowledge in all of us, again, absent some significant biological impairment. And so that means that the environmental world in which students and humans live in cannot be a reason to think that anyone lacks the capacity to build the same knowledge. There is all sorts of implicit beliefs that people have, sometimes coded in genetics, sometimes coded in racism, sometimes through other social factors, where they simply think that there's clever students or clever people and those that aren't. And it's not that there aren't differences, and some of those differences are manifested in those ways, but it's that, as far as we know, when it comes to that building of knowledge piece, whatever challenges exist from the environment and whatever limitations we have in our conscious working memory, that long-term memory, that store of knowledge that we can build, is unaffected by that. And so that, to me, is the profound point of like not allowing environmental factors to be an excuse for our expectations. And it's interesting because in the world that I live in, schools of education sometimes like call what I'm describing the science of learning, they call it like the cognitive model, and they explicitly contrast it with what they'll call the socio-cultural model. And it's like, if you understand the cognitive model, you have to understand that the socio-cultural is bound right to it. It's a yin and a yang. Like, those are not things that should be, that's a false dichotomy to say that there's a socio-cultural way of learning and then there's a cognitive way of learning. It's like the two things are intimately bound together.
So what are some of the thoughts on the socio-cultural? What are some of the main thoughts out of that?
Well,
when you think about, like, explain that to someone who's not really like versed in this.
Yeah, well, the socio-cultural model is actually, I think it's similar to what you just said. So you talked about Black educators, pre-Brown v. Board of Education, past Brown v. Board of Education, having certain knowledge that allowed them to reach Black students in their care. That's quote unquote socio-cultural, right? That is something coming out of the Black education experience under American apartheid, learning how to find a way to provide an education, notwithstanding that, to students who would not get it, or at least would probably not have educators who understood what the situation was if they were white, right? So that's a piece, and that's just one slice of the vast set of human experiences that we can put under the umbrella of sociocultural. So they matter. Like, and I think part of what is unfortunate is that people have sort of seen learning science as separate from that piece. The two things are interacting constantly. Our lives are a constant process of whatever's happening out here in the real world and what we're thinking about it and trying to make sense of it. So that's what I mean by the sociocultural aspect of education. As I say, I think it's unfortunate that a dichotomy, a false dichotomy, has been set up around how that works.
So I comment and then one question. So the comment, I would say, like, it would be great to get Vanessa Siddle-Walker on here at one point, because much of the work that she's done is about them as educators in the Black South, what they were learning about teaching, not just out of like that they were Black, but just that they were having to solve problems on a daily basis with a population of kids that were, poor and in a country that hated them or whatever. So they were learning real pedagogical things. So part of that Black educational capital that the white schools didn't have at the time was years and years and years of solving actual learning problems with a population that created pedagogical knowledge around what the pedagogy should be. The question I have for you too, are there still echoes of like the bell curve stuff in educational science and in higher ed? Is that still a thing? And,
well,
do you feel like you would hold your own on a panel if that was coming up again?
I mean, I wish I could say that there weren't, but Charles Murray is still around and writing books about this. And I think the new frontier around this has been around polygenetic scores, which is a subject of a whole different thing. There's actually been a lot of research being done around that. So unfortunately, yes. And unfortunately, sometimes folks in the education community who I think don't really know what they're talking about have sort of casually invoked those without knowing the history around this. I mean, this is the really hard part about this. And I understand, I do understand why people would be sort of so skeptical to just reject learning science, because the history of science generally and the history of science around how we think and intelligence particularly is a horrible history. It is. There's just there's no
Mhm.
getting around the fact that there was racists left and right who wanted to scientifically prove the superiority of white people. I mean, that's just a fact
Mhm.
historically. I would cautiously, tentatively, and understanding that for me to say it maybe means very little. I would say that the building of scientific over time that may have started from that very terrible place is still good science. And if science is worth defending and advocating for, and I do believe that, notwithstanding the history, the same way that I believe America is worth advocating for, notwithstanding our terrible history, I think that I could speak to the fact that there is a way, when you really get to the people who really understand this stuff,
Mhm.
they will tell you that actually, like, the beauty is the more complex learning and intelligence and all of these things seem than people who want to reduce it to one race is better than the other. That, like, if there's anything that we have learned in the 30 years since the bell curve has come out, it's just how profoundly wrong that is. You know,
Mhm.
the complexity of who we are. It's like the same thing happens biological that happens in the world. It is so complex, it's hard to tease out any particular one thing. So it's a subject that gives me some angst because I've seen people in this space sort of blithely make comments that have profoundly disturbed me, and I think it's something that, you know, frankly, as a field, a lot of work needs to be done.
Yeah, I think, you know, listening to you, the way that you just explained it a minute ago about the limitless capacity, you know, that people who don't have a cognitive impairment have, which is like, you know, most people, is a way of rescuing, I think, that science. The way that David Didow talks about it, or Didow talks about it, was really appealing to me because I'm looking for the good news, right? Like, I call it the achievement gospel. People hear me say that every day. I want the good news about
Yeah,
achievement. I don't want the bad news. But if you do read the Murray stuff, there's some pretty like strong statements in there, like the majority of scientists know exactly what I'm saying is true,
yeah,
and they're afraid to say it, but they know that the science backs me up and whatnot. And you're a layperson, you're reading that, you're thinking, okay, we got a problem, because like if it's a consensus of science that IQ leads to like educational determinism, then why try? Like
yeah,
after that, it's kind of like, why try? And then here you come with David and others saying, no, 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 no. Like wherever a kid starts out with some of the like the natural gifts and the gifts of home, you still can make them cleverer, is what David Didow says, which means you can add to their knowledge and their ability to learn and increase it anyways. So,
yeah.
so I
But
appreciate you for saying that.
and I know we're probably over
Yeah.
time. I can keep going, and I'm happy to, but I will just say that ironically, David, and he knows this, and I'll just say it. He's one of the people I'm thinking of who I think has been unhelpful. In
Really?
some
Oh, wow.
ways. Yeah, yeah, you
Okay.
know,
All
and
right. Say more about
he's
this.
walked he's
Yeah.
walked back from, but like, you know, a few years ago, he would say comments on Twitter that I think reflected the fact that he um, doesn't, you know where his blind spots are around this.
Mm,
And he made
mhm.
some comments that charitably could be described as, racially provocative, and I think
I know what that's code for.
yeah,
Yeah.
again, I don't think it comes from. I mean, I know David. We've been at various events and what have
Mhm,
you.
mhm.
I think that for whatever it's worth, heart seems to be in the right place. But again, this goes to the danger of A, not knowing the history, B, like
Mhm.
reflecting about who you are as a person. Like again, a white guy like myself coming and saying, well, yes, the history of intelligent science has been incredibly racist, but trust us now, it's not anymore. I mean, there's wrong messenger, right?
Mhm,
Wrong messenger for
mhm,
that.
mhm.
So that's why, like, ironically, when he's probably one of the people I had in mind when I was saying that, like, it has not been helpful, I think, to advance learning science and education to dance with near ignorance on the edge of a fraught history that really needs to be taken into deeper consideration.
Mhm.
And as you say, we need to be really explicit about lifting up those things in learning science that give the lie to having lower expectations for any student.
Mhm.
And that's part of what I think. Certainly, going forward, one of the things I've had to do is be more diligent about that.
So you've blown my mind like 5 times today. Now you're gonna make me go
Oh,
back and read David's work again, and with a different lens. I was really like keying in on how the Murray thing really does lead to educational essentialism, which to me actually becomes a real problem. Like if your belief gap is so strong based upon that, then you can't go anywhere with that. There's no like real possibilities. So to see someone like David come along and say like, no, educational essentialism is not the thing. Actually, every kid can be made smarter, like by adding to their knowledge, right?
Yeah.
That to me sounds like good news if you're reflecting on Murray's work.
Yes.
But what you just told me is like so many things, it gets complicated because you can just, one way of solving inequity can create other inequities, which is the complexity of education.
Yeah.
I want to end on this. First of all, I want to thank you for coming on today. This has like been very helpful, I think, in my understanding and others. And the comments have been great. Folks are watching this and mostly agreeing with you. And there's educators in the feed who I think are linking in to what you're saying, like they know it to be reality. I do think in terms of kind of oftentimes, if you're going to tell me that there are 4 things like the building blocks of effective educator preparation, and I know that we're being misserved as a community, I'm going to want to see those things like take root. Right.
Me too.
Yeah. I want to see them take root. And, whereas, you've kind of like tempered my wanting that to come from a high place, like Moses coming down and saying the 4 commandments of education now are these 4 things, But I wonder if you can tell me if we all have a role to play as a voter, as a parent, as a community member, as somebody who cares about these issues. Do we have a role to play in pushing what you're pushing, these better, practices, or is this exclusively a thing that has to be taken care of in the education circles at a high level amongst deans and schools?
No, I mean, look, I will always, it's a movement, like I said earlier, and it will only succeed if it is broad-based. And so I think parents, even, just concerned citizens, like, look, if we're living in a time, if like, unlike any other, I think, at least in my lifetime, where understanding science is really important. And to the extent we're not understanding science, we're facing real challenges as a result of that. So part of this is about, in some ways, the specific things that we've talked about over the last hour around specific ways in which we think and learn. But part of this goes to like, fostering a belief in using insights that we have gleaned in our society in a way that will be more productive. And so it's really about a culture of, see, the bad side of science is the part I talked about, the history of racism, the use of it in ways that are terrible. But the good side of science is a healthy skepticism, a refusal to just be dogmatic, a spirit of questioning. Now, these are the ideals. It's not always led up to, but in many ways, I think, democracy and science are bound up together conceptually. And I just think that we will do well to foster both of them if we have everybody caring about both of them.
Ooh, I love that. Democracy and science are bound up together. Okay, that's a t-shirt for people watching. This is a new t-shirt. Listen, Benjamin, I'm so glad that you came on today. This is very helpful.
Really
I would love for you to come back because you probably, when I go back and review this, I'm probably going to have 80 questions that lead to like other conversations we can have. If you are watching this and you are hearing this, please go read. We put the links into the comments to the documents from Deans for Impact. The one that I really would hope I would hope that you would read all of them, but the one on learning science, of course, but the one on the building blocks to me was really smart. And it, for me as a layperson who's really interested, like a nerd to geek out on what educators are supposed to be learning, it just was so simple to me. It made so much sense. So look for it, the building blocks of effective educator preparation, which the 4 building blocks are modeling, feedback, practice, and alignment. And I would hope that us as lay people can like internalize that and know that this is a thing. This is what teachers should be taught. If you're looking for Benjamin, his Twitter feed has been going across the bottom, so you can find him on Twitter. And I thank you guys for watching, for listening, and always adding so much to the show. This has been another rich show. We'll see you tomorrow when we're talking to